The Kiros Report is truly honored to bring a great philosopher whom I have known for many, many years. In fact, this particular episode is an exercise in remembrance, remembrance about things in the past. When I moved to the Boston area in 1982 with a PhD in philosophy from Kent State University and contemplating about doing another PhD at Harvard University, I heard of a political theorist who at the time was teaching in the Department of Political Science at MIT. I became curious and I dared to walk in right to his office. He was very young and handsome, as he is now. He welcomed me. He inquired about who I am, and he had a special fondness for Ethiopians because he was a good friend of the great Andreas Shetty, who was my teacher and my friend who passed away recently. I gently asked him if I could sit in his course. He says, of course you can. So I sat in his modern political philosophy course, not once only, but twice. I hope he remembers. Which led me eventually, through a mutual friend, to be introduced to the great John Rawls. I met John Rawls for the first time at a Dunkin' Donut shop in Fresh Pond. I sat right next to him, introduced myself to him very charmingly, and then chatted with him. And I did the same as I did with Josh Cohen. I asked him if I could sit in his courses. He generously said he could. I sat in at least 3 or 4 of John Rawls' seminars, and also 2 seminars with the great Quine. So although I couldn't institutionally acquire a PhD from Harvard University, which was a dream, because at the time I became married with the first child and the ambition was thwarted. But I'm proud to have been indirectly trained by John Rawls and also Josh Cohen, his friend. Professor Josh Cohen was the chair of the Department of Political Science at MIT, I believe from 1979 to about 2007, which then led him to go to Stanford, in which he was a professor, and then eventually landed at Apple University. He has published extensively. I counted about 13 books, which are a combination of books that he wrote directly and also co-edited books. And his 2 famous books are Deliberative Democracy and also Global Justice, in addition to prominent articles in journals such as the Philosophy and Public Affairs. He also continues to be an editor of a prestigious magazine, the Boston Review to date. So these are some of my remembrances. And now, the theme that is going to command our attention for the next 1 hour or so, because he's extremely busy, is this classic tension between liberty and equality, which was first formulated by a tradition that is formally known as the social contract tradition, spearheaded by the likes of John Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. Hobbes, of course, famously attempted to reconcile this tension by creating a great Leviathan that is going to restrain and suppress civil liberties when necessary, so that order could prevail somehow, which led John Locke to be slightly more open and more generous, and his way of reconciling the tension between liberty and equality is to pay equal homage to both, followed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on whom Josh Cohen wrote a singular book. On the other hand, thought that given the nature of human beings as essentially compassionate, truthful, sincere, so forth and so on, liberty and equality could somehow be reconciled by not using coercive devices. This tradition was also further followed by Kant himself, who theorized about the possibility of perpetual peace by combining the resources of politics and morality, and thinking of human beings as potentially moral. It is this tradition to which the great John Rawls returns to, and which he reconfigures and revitalizes by creating two brilliant devices. One, the veil of ignorance, and the second one, what you call the difference principle. The original position is truly remarkable because it attempts to pretend as if as a process of conditioning, social conditioning or hegemonic conditioning that human beings have become subjected to, by putting them in situations in which they would somehow bracket the effects of the social conditioning and think about what it means to be just and create just institutions freely, unencumbered and unhindered by these years and years of conditioning that human beings have become subjected to. I have dared to ask Professor Josh Cohen to make a case for what John Rawls has accomplished, particularly in this tumultuous time in which once again the tension between the liberties and equality is being fought rudely at a very unkind marketplace. Take it from there, Professor, and make a case for the theory of justice.
Well, thank you, Teodros. It's so good to see you again after a very long time. And I not only appreciate the generosity of your introduction of me, but the breadth of your presentation about the issues that we're going to be exploring. I just, if I might mention two things before getting into the main topic about Rawls and John Rawls's theory of justice. You mentioned our mutual friend Andreas Eshete, who I knew well from beginning in 1970, in the spring of my first year as an undergraduate at Yale. Andreas was actually my first philosophy teacher. So I not only had a deep affection and respect for him, but also a great sense of gratitude for his having introduced me to the field. And also, he wrote a very important piece on John Rawls's theory of justice that he published in Ethics in 1974. And it was a way for me to get a better sense of what it meant to take these ideas seriously and really get into the details of them. So Andreas, who, as you mentioned, passed away recently, was a very dear friend, but also my first philosophy teacher. The other, I want to just briefly add, you mentioned the Boston Review, which I've been editor or co-editor of since 1991 for 34 years. Boston Review had already been around for 16 years when I started doing it. So I've done it for most of 2/3 of its life. But if you notice, I mentioned 16 and 34 because if you put them together, you get 50. This is our 50th anniversary year. And I feel it important to take every opportunity to mention that we've been around for 50 years, which I think for a magazine committed to ideas and argument is, if I may say, a remarkable achievement. So that said, we get to the main topic for today, Teodros, which is Rawls's theory of justice. And you already touched on a number of the essential ideas in Rawls's theory, including, in particular, and I think this is a very important piece of it, what you called and what Rawls calls the the aim of reconciling the fundamental values of liberty and equality, rather than, as is more conventional, treating liberty and equality as fundamentally warring ideas between which you have to choose sides. Milton Friedman said in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, you can be a liberal or you can be an egalitarian. You have to choose. You can't be both. And Rawls's theory of justice is, which aims to effectuate this reconciliation of liberty and equality, can be understood as an effort to provide an alternative way to think about those political values. But let me step back from that specific feature, very important specific feature, and describe a theory of justice in emphasizing 4 points about it. Theory of Justice, as you said, was published in 1971. It's a long and complicated book, a remarkable achievement. There aren't many things like it, and that have that kind of comprehensive and carefully argued quality. It's in some ways like Plato's Republic or Hobbes's Leviathan or Rousseau's Social Contract or the work of John Stuart Mill, or in a more modern register, in some ways like Hayek's book, Constitution of Liberty. And so the 4 issues that I'll say a little bit about are, first, Rawls calls his theory justice as fairness. So we'll say something about that. Then secondly, there's the idea of what he calls the original position, which is a way of taking the social contract idea and elaborating it in a distinctive way. The third is about his 2 principles of justice, which aim to achieve that reconciliation of liberty and equality. And the fourth point is, why might somebody think that this set of ideas has any grip on people's motivations, that it has any kind of realism for human beings? What's the psychological reality of it all? So justice is fairness, the original position, 2 principles of justice, and this psychological motivational story, which will get us to the tumult. That last point will get us to the tumultuous present. I promise. Okay? All right.
Excellent.
Good. So the first point, Rawls famously says in A Theory of Justice that justice is, as he puts it, the first virtue of institutions. I mean, there are many things that you might like to have in a society. You want it to be exciting and ambitious and to do great things and to be interesting. But justice, he says, is the first virtue. It's like the prophet Amos. Take away from me your songs and your festivals, but let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So justice is really fundamental. But there are lots of people who might say that and might say it, authentically, not just giving lip service to that idea. But then there are competing ideas about what justice requires. So how can we get some kind of more substantial, richer picture of what justice requires? And this is the first idea. Rawls says we should think that what a just society is a fair society. It's as he puts it, a fair system of social cooperation. It's not just that my dealings with you are fair and my dealings with some, it's a fair society, a fair system of social cooperation. So he's going to try to give an account of what justice requires by saying something about what a fair society is. That's the first point. Now, you might reasonably think, well, that's a nice idea, but people disagree as much about what fairness requires as they disagree about what justice requires. So you might think we really haven't made that much headway by moving from justice to fairness. And that's where the idea of the original position comes in. So Rawls thinks if you want to work out what justice is by working out what fairness is, what is a fair system of social cooperation, he thinks you put individual people in conditions that are fair and let them, under those fair conditions, decide what the principles will be for their society. That's the social contract idea. And his way of thinking about what those fair conditions are, and this is obviously a contestable idea, is he thinks it's fair conditions means conditions that treat those individual participants in the deliberation about the principles of justice, that treats them as free and equal moral persons. And putting aside lots of the complex details there, what's I think very important about that is that in that situation, that fair situation where we're going to decide about our principles, what Rawls says we should focus on are things that are common, not on our differences. We're going to focus on things that we all have, he says, this nature as free and equal moral persons. And then the question is, well, how do you get people in this situation where they're going to be choosing principles to focus on that? And that's where he uses this device. This is part of the original position. He uses this device of the veil of ignorance. So, you're different from me. You look different. You're better looking than me. We're about the same age. Probably, maybe I'm a little older than you. I don't know. Our color is different. Our national background is different. People have differences in their religious convictions, in their aspirations, in their gender, their social identities, all kinds of, and in their social class, all these sorts of differences. And so what Rawls says is when we're picking the principles for our society, trying to decide what's fair, we're going to try to put all of that stuff to aside. That's not, he says, that's not relevant. Those things are not relevant to deciding that. And so we're going to, I think he puts it this way someplace, we're going to model the irrelevance of those factors by assuming that people are ignorant about them. Model irrelevance through ignorance. Imagine that you're making this choice and you don't know any of those things. And now you say, what could that possibly mean? How could I not know those things? I don't know that I'm a man. What do you mean I don't know that I'm a man? I just look. I can see that I am. And but the idea is veil of ignorance means that when we're trying to figure out what the principles are, we can't make any reference to those things. We're going to put them, as you said, we're going to bracket them. We're going to put them aside. We're going to act as if we were making a decision in ignorance of them. We're just going to focus on those commonalities as free and equal moral persons. Okay, so that's step two. So justice is fairness. We're going to figure out what fairness requires by putting people in these fair conditions, putting those differences aside, focusing on what's common as free and equal moral persons by imagining this condition of ignorance. And now we're going to make a decision. And Rawls famously argues in Theory of Justice that under those conditions of ignorance, we're going to choose two principles of justice. What are the principles? First principle is a principle of equal basic liberties. What does that mean? It means that everyone has a right to the same expansive set of liberties, consistent with everybody else having a right to those basic liberties. So, religious liberty, for example, freedom of expression, liberties associated with the rule of law, political liberty. Everyone has a right to those. And because of his sense about the importance of democracy in resolving our disagreements in a society, Rawls thinks that the democracy required by his first principle is a democracy in which people have fair chances, equal opportunities for influencing the political process, whatever their socioeconomic position is. There's a kind of fair equality of opportunity for political influence. Okay, so that's the first principle, equal basic liberties with this special provision for a fair value of political liberty. The second principle, now remember there are two principles. Second principle has two components. The details are complicated, but the thing is, the problem is complicated. If the details were simple, then you wouldn't be engaged with the problem. So I make no apology for the complexities. It's as we say in my neighborhood, it's a feature, not a bug, the complexities. So the second principle, one component is an equal opportunity component. And the essential idea, Rawls calls it equality of fair opportunity, is that your genesis should not be your destiny. Where you end up shouldn't be determined by where you start out. So a little more precisely, if you take two people, say me and you, and we have the same aspirations, and we have the same abilities, we should have equal chances to achieve desirable social positions, regardless of the social conditions of socioeconomic conditions that we start from. That's what I mean by genesis not fixing destiny. So equality of fair opportunity. It's not just legal equality of opportunity, it's equality of fair opportunity. And then there's the most famous part of Rawls's principles. This is in the second principle. Part two is what he calls the difference principle. The main idea of the difference principle is it's fine, it's not unfair and not unjust in a society for some people to be better off than other people. It's not flat equality that's required. But if there are inequalities, the inequalities have to work to the, as he puts it, the maximum benefit of the least advantaged group. You're not trying to maximize for the median. This isn't people in the United States, political discourse tends to focus on the middle class. Rawls says, well, actually, what we want to do is make sure that the least advantaged group is as well off as possible. To maximize it. Think of the least advantage as people say in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. So those are the two principles. So the first thing is we have justice. Justice is fairness. That's point one. Secondly, we're going to work out what fairness, thus justice, requires through this device of an original position, reasoning behind the veil of ignorance, focusing on our commonalities. And three, what happens when we do that is we end up with these two principles: equal basic liberties, fair equality of opportunity, and the difference principle. And those two principles are what Rawls means by a reconciliation of the values of liberty and equality, because each of the principles has a liberty side to it and an equality side to it, but they're integrated. The values are connected. Last point, fourth. You might say, well, this is all very nice. It's a very fancy ideal. A democratic society, a democratic polity, everybody has fair opportunities, the inequalities work to the maximum benefit of the least advantage, although, of course, they're also working to other people's advantage, but they're worked to the maximum benefit of the least advantaged. But how does this grab on to people? Why are people going to be moved to act in accordance with these principles? Because this is supposed to be, in a kind of Kantian spirit, practical philosophy. These principles are supposed to guide you as an agent, not just guide you as an observing judge, sitting back and saying, oh, that's just, that's unjust. No, these are supposed to guide public discussion and political conduct. Well, why would they do that? And here, the central idea is reciprocity. So Rawls thinks that the fundamental element of human motivation, so he's not alone in thinking this, is a long tradition in anthropology and social psychology and evolutionary biology of emphasizing the importance of reciprocity. But focusing on Rawls, he thinks that the way that people acquire a kind of moral sensibility, including a sensibility of political morality, is through reciprocity. What does that mean? What it means is that when they see that let me personalize it. When I see how my well-being, what my good is being affirmed and taken into consideration, treated as equally important by the way the society works, by its guiding principles, those two principles. When I recognize that, I am disposed to respond in kind. That is, to treat other people's good, their interest, as equally important, as important as mine. And so I develop, this is simplifying a complicated story, but I develop a disposition to act according to those principles when I see that I'm being treated in accordance with those principles. Now, and this brings us, Teodros, and this is my last point. Sorry, the complicated architecture. That's what happens when I recognize that I am being treated in accordance with those principles. What happens when I think that I'm not? When I think that I'm treated as a no count, don't count for anything, or counting for less, when my good is not affirmed and treated as equally important, then what you end up with is not the development of this sense of justice along with other people. That you end up with a kind of righteous anger, not just anger, and not just righteousness, but righteous anger, because you're not being taken seriously, not being treated as an equal. So there is a Rawlsian story. I don't mean a mere story. I think a plausible argument about why politics, say in the United States, but not only in the United States, looks the way it does. It's not because people tried out the Rawlsian ideas and they fail, it's because what's happened is there has been a sustained, publicly visible violation of those principles. And maybe the principles are right or maybe the principles are wrong. But if you accept Rawls's overall argument, then you would actually predict. You would predict that with the explosive expansion of inequality, the dismissal of the concerns about people whose lives, whose communities, whose jobs have been obliterated, you would expect people
to get angry,
to be angry, and instead of just dwelling on the anger, why are people so angry? You recognize that the anger is righteous. Anyway, that's Rawls. There you have it. That's my.
That is incredible, Josh. First of all, this performance takes me back to 1982 when I took your modern philosophy course, in which you were just brilliant. You still are, in fact, more brilliant now with the seasoning of time. Now, let me trigger your imagination so that we can now apply this to the analysis of what I call the tumultuous time.
Yeah.
Recently, Nancy Fraser, who's an admirer of yours, and a Rawlsian and a Marxist, a combination of both, powerful blend, has written with two other theorists a book called, I think, Feminist Manifesto, in which I sense a very astute way of engaging the two principles of justice by dispensing with the concept of the class struggle, and instead use this concept of the 99% and 1%, which, as you know, Josh, is a way of addressing the tensions between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, which in my introduction I contended is a manifestation of conditioning, which the veil of ignorance is systematically bracketing so that it could work with what is common to all of us, and temporarily suspend the differences so that we can appeal to the common and then address the differences by another device, namely the difference principle. Now, let's take this concept of the 99% and 1% as a tension between the advantaged and disadvantaged, so that we can analyze the tumultuous present. Take it there.
There is force. This is, what was in the arguments developed by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and others focused on the United States. The distinction between the 99% and the 1% isn't, though it originated with a marketing firm. It isn't just a marketing idea. If you look at the most extreme inequalities in the United States, both of income and of wealth, things get really extreme when you get to the 1% or the 0.1% or the 0.01%, or it's the smaller it gets. This is a place, slicing it more thinly doesn't make the issue go away. So I think what seems uh, very clear to me is that under those circumstances, with a pretty small group of people getting the lion's share. I mean, there's variation over time, but a pretty small group of people getting the lion's share of the benefits, that you're going to end up with pretty stark violations of those two principles of justice.
Right.
And it's probably easiest with the difference principle. I mean, if you have these stark inequalities, chances are pretty good that you are not limiting your inequalities to those that work to the maximum benefit of the least advantage. It looks like you're maximizing. It's maxi max rather than maxi min. I mean, you've got inequalities that are maximizing the benefit to the most advantage, not maximizing benefit to the least advantaged, however conceived. But also, in addition, in addition, chances are pretty good that you're going to be violating the principle of fair opportunity. And that's what in Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, he describes two paths to sustained and growing inequality. One is what he calls the hyper-patrimonial path, and the other is the hyper-meritocratic path. And the difference between those two is that whereas on the hyper-meritocratic path, the inequalities come from extravagant differences in labor market compensation, in the hyper-patrimonial path, the inequalities grow from differences in income that owe fundamentally to differences in wealth positions. Well, what does that have to do with inequalities of opportunity? Because what people do with wealth, with their assets, the stock, not the flow, that's income. What people do with the stock is they pass it along intergenerationally. So in the hyper-patrimonial society, where you have these stark inequalities, people have very, very different starting positions. You don't have what people sometimes call starting gate equality. You have gross starting gate inequality. And then where you end up, your destiny is very dependent on your genesis. Where you end up does depend very substantially on where you start out. And if you look in the United States in particular, and if you treat intergenerational mobility as a good proxy for opportunity. So high mobility means that there's pretty good equality of opportunity. Very low intergenerational mobility means that there's not much equality of opportunity. The American performance on intergenerational mobility is not particularly good. So there's restrictions on upward mobility, and particularly, and there's a racial difference here for white kids, that there's pretty significant limits on downward mobility. You're born where you end up does depend on where you start. And also, and just one last point on this, Teodros, because I think this is really fundamental. It's not only just thinking of it from a Rawlsian point of view, you've got 99%, 1%, you've got difference principle. That's, don't have to dwell on that for a long time, but equality of opportunity. But also, it's very unlikely. The more gross the inequality is, the less likely it is that you're going to have a fair democracy where people have equal chances for political influence. And you can do all you want, not that this happens, but you could do all you want about trying to, have campaign finance regulations. But if you have huge inequalities and you try to regulate their impact on politics through campaign finance regulation, I think of that as like my experiences living in Cambridge near Fresh Pond, and we had a leaky basement. And you can plug those holes all you want. You can coat them. You can dig trenches. That goddamn water is going to get into your basement some way or another. And it's the same thing with money and politics. It's really gross. And the stakes are pretty high. So if you got a lot of resources, it would be irresponsible not to use them to try to influence. So it's an impossible task. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's the kind of thing that Nancy Fraser, wonderful political theorist, and one has contributed to Boston Review, wonderful political theorist. I'm not sure if that's what she and her co-authors have in mind, but that's a Rawlsian perspective on that, those inequalities.
That's exactly what she had in mind. You captured it quite well. I'm sure she'll be very pleased with you. Now, let's develop an internal critique of the limitations of the theory of justice.
Yeah.
You have written two foundational books, which I read very carefully, and I enjoyed them both. Deliberative Democracy and Global Justice. And I now want you to use your own contributions to really make the Rawlsian challenge of addressing our tumultuous time in the absence of the tendency that the notion of class struggle has in American discourse. People just don't like to talk about class struggles. But they do like to talk about maximizing the capacities of the rich and well-to-do from all kinds of perspectives, including religious sentiments, to help the least advantaged, which I think is what Rawls, I don't know how religious he was drawing from, so that he could cavalierly use the original position, not because he's not aware of the residues of conditioning, as I called it, but that following Kant, he thought that the capacity to think morally is an inherent power that human beings as human beings have, which in my own work on Kemet, ancient Kemet, led me to revitalize what engaging the human heart, as I called it, in contrast to the brain does, so that we can make the ideals of working with the original position as a device, as something that is doable, because it is already in us. It's a matter of revitalizing it and minimizing the calculative tendencies of the brain, which has a tendency of conditioning us to look at life transactionally, whereas the heart following the resources of the great India and the great China, the magisterial spiritual thinkers, which is a tradition, I think, that Rousseau in particular exploited, on whom you wrote, gives us these powers, these inherent powers that we have, what you call the cooperation, the kindness, the generosity, thinking for the other, so forth and so on. I'm taking you to kinds of places now. And I'm sure you're going to reduce it to Rawlsian formulations. Please do.
Yeah. Very hard, interesting, and important questions and reflections. And let me start with a Rawlsian formulation,
Please.
and won't capture all elements of what you've said, the rich comments that you've made. But Rawls distinguishes, not alone in distinguishing, but he distinguishes between what he calls the reasonable and the rational. And the rational is what you were referring to as the calculative side. It's the strategic side. It's the side where you're thinking, maybe not selfishly. It could be your, for your group, could be but you've got a goal. And what you're going to do is try to make it as likely as possible that that goal is achieved. And why make it unlikely that the goal is going to be achieved? What are you supposed to do? It's your goal. But that's different from what he calls the reasonable. And let me connect this back to what I said before about the idea of reciprocity.
Yes.
So when I moved by reciprocity, what I do, this is the story, is I respond in kind to somebody else. I don't mean I respond kindly, though that may be true too, but there's a kind of doing to them or for them what they've done for me. You've shown concern for my good, you're treating me as an equal, then whatever else I do, whatever my goals are, and whatever my strategies are for achieving those goals, they operate within this frame where I'm going to take it as a requirement, a constraint, if you like, that I'm going to treat you as an equal. So I'm not just going to be calculative. I'm not just going to engage in a kind of bargaining with you where I'm trying to get the best deal that I can get, knowing that you're going to be trying to get the best deal that you can get. But I take your interests seriously, and that puts certain kinds of things out of bounds. So the reasonable is a way of talking about my having, kind of moral capacities that I take other people as just as important as I am. I don't put myself on a pedestal or to use a Kantian phrasing about it. I don't treat them merely as a means, but treat them as an end. I treat us as, in Kant's phrase, the law-giving members of the republic of ends. And so it's not, so I'm gonna, there's a limit on to use another term that you used, there's a limit on how much in my engagements with other people, either in the same society or across borders, there's a limit on how much I'm going to be transactional. And we know who we're talking about when we say that. Mr. Transact, we're talking about Mr. Transactional there.
Indeed.
Indeed. And yeah. So I'm not sure, Teodros, if that gets I want to add one more point here, because I think this is very important. These ways of thinking about issues, these kind of philosophical ways of thinking about issues, a kind of orientation to justice, to fairness, to reasonableness, to some kind of principles, to treating other people with respect. Those are things that you have to be prepared for. You can't, it's not a kind of an in the moment thing.
Correct.
It's got to be part of, you have to deeply internalize these ways of thinking about things. I mean, they may be natural in some way. That is, we have the meaning that we have a capacity, part of our nature to do this, but they're not natural in being the default state.
Correct.
It needs thinking, it needs reflection, it needs preparation. I'll tell a story about this because I think Rawls himself really thought that these philosophical issues are very important as part of the background that people bring to situations. And it's important not to think of them as academic reflections or as people sticking their head up in the clouds. And so when I was a first year PhD student at Harvard, so a long time ago, this is 1973, 74. In 1974, so spring 74, it's my second semester of my first year, Rawls was teaching a seminar on Kant's moral philosophy. And in the seminar, we read the groundwork. He said, just start off by reading everything. And then so we talked a bunch of the groundwork and the second critique and the book on religion within the limits of reason. And there was the class met on a Wednesday, as I remember. So we had the class. I get home. Here I am. I'm 22 years old. And I get a phone call from Rawls.
Yeah, that's him.
What's this? And he says, I hope that was okay today. And at the time, I thought, whoa, why is John Rawls asking me? Hey. And one way to think about it, completely wrong, I think. One way to think about it is there's John Rawls sitting in his office and he thinks, oh, I want to validate this student. I want to make the student feel good. And I think if I call him, to ask how the class went, he's going to feel. I don't think it was that at all. I mean, he was a very supportive and teacher, and he had a large number of students who all had affection and great respect and affection for him. I think the reason he called was he thought, I'm teaching Kant. That's a big deal. Not just a big deal intellectually. It's a big deal as a practical matter. These ideas are really consequential. And I want to know how it was because I want to make sure that I am doing a decent job of conveying the substance of these ideas. Yeah. Anyway, I think he was right about that. I do think that they don't answer all questions, and that's a very important. There's a limit on the range of questions they can answer, and they shouldn't answer all questions. That would be bad to have some philosophical argument for some principles, and now you just some complicated situation comes up and you say, okay, how do I apply the principles to this situation? Requires judgment. There's reasonable disagreement about how they evolve. Nevertheless, they're very important.
Incredible. I resonate with all this. I have to publicly say the following. I love John Rawls, the man.
Yeah.
He was a living practice of ethics.
Yeah.
He really lived his life in accordance with these moral potentials that he was trying to extract from human beings. Now, at the expense of flattering you, and take my compliment seriously, I don't flatter easily. There is a cottage industry that is interpreting roles. I myself, when he was alive, took the two principles of justice and tried to apply them to solve what was called a food crisis in the continent of Africa in 1982. And I did reformulate the relationship between the two principles of justice. I made the first second and the second first because the material conditions in the continents were such that, to use your term, global justice, that needed immediate attention. So I bracketed the importance of the civil liberties and tried to highlight the importance of using the difference principle to engage the African bourgeoisie, in particular symbols of the most advantaged, to be morally challenged and maximally, not minimally, but maximally contribute to the conditions of the least advantaged. I showed him the book. I was a bit shy to ask him to endorse it because the book was already published. I will never know whether he approved of it or not because I dared to restructure the two principles of justice by essentially saying the first is second and the second is first. But the man is so kind that he did not attack me because I did not use him intra-transactionally to build a career. I just shared the book with him, I signed it, and I gave it to him. So in my judgment, you are the best interpreter of John Rawls, and I stand by it. Now, I recently was asked to contribute an article on Charles Mills, to the CLR James Journal. I wrote a very controversial article that I think will be published very soon, in which I challenged Charles, who thought that John Rawls was not sensitive to racism. I said, in fact, it is precisely the case that you can use the two principles of justice and develop, in fact, a critique of racism. That John Rawls does not have to use the term racism in every page so that he could exemplify the concern of human beings who happen to be blacks, so that they would think that their issues are being addressed. I said, in fact, the two principles of justice themselves could be used to develop a theory of a well-ordered society in which the very idea of racism itself is a violation of what human beings should not be doing, because it's not the virtue of social institutions. Racism cannot possibly be the virtue of any social institution because it's by definition unfair. Take it from there.
Yeah. So let me, the story that you tell about your book is it's a wonderful story. I agree with you completely about how Rawls was an embodiment of the ideas about treating people with respect as equals that he wrote about. And that's why he had so many fantastic, wonderful PhD students, including particularly strikingly for someone of his generation, a very large number of very distinguished women, moral and political philosophers. I mean, including Chris Korsgaard and Barbara Herman, among many others.
Many.
Yeah, yes. In 1993, I went to a conference in Ethiopia organized by Andreas.
Correct.
And it was there were about 750 people who came to the conference, and it was about drafting a new constitution for
I meant to
Ethiopia.
mention that, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I meant to mention it. I apologize.
No, not at all. It was it has a particular relevance to the story that you told, and it was an amazing bunch of people, including political theorists from the United States. Elaine Scarry was there, and Alan Buchanan, Sami Assefa, who became ambassador. Sami was there was a had been a Princeton PhD, and we were talking about the very fancy political theory ideas and also very concrete ideas. I was tasked with giving a presentation on issues about freedom of expression. So I laid out a set of ideas about freedom of expression, which probably, were more, kind of First Amendment aligned than lots of people in the room felt. And you'll see why I'm telling this story now. Somebody in the audience memorably says to me, aren't these liberties of speech, isn't this a luxury in the circumstances that we're in? It was a kind of what Bertolt Brecht said, first the bread, then the morals. So, and I was, and I responded, I don't remember the details of my response, but I disagreed. I suppose I was preserving some kind of ordering of the two principles I was emphasizing. But I didn't say just, no, in the abstract, freedom of expression is more important than dealing with the food crisis. I said that the liberties that I was describing are liberties that enable people to acquire information that they wouldn't otherwise be able to acquire, and to organize and to fight. So they have a kind of significance. They're not just individual, I get to say what I want liberties. They have an importance to the public, social, political process of dealing with issues like food shortages. And what I didn't say, but I would say this now if somebody asked me the question, is that I would refer to the work of Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze, famine. And that famines, that their argument is that famines are not about a shortage of food. The food is around. It's just not in the mouths of people who are starving from it. And you don't get those famines. You don't get famines. This is the argument. You don't get famines when you've got a free press and a free flow of information, and people can learn. No, there's plenty of food, 50 miles away. It's just that it's not getting to us here where we need it. So I was, and I'll just say, I was too glib in my response. And I hope I would say something a little bit more thoughtful now. But I do think that there's something basically right about the idea that it's not a good way to deal with really crushing human burdens like famines to just say, well, let's worry about protecting liberty, freedoms of speech, expression down the road sometime when we've solved all these other problems. To come to Charles Mills, wonderful person. I really, really liked Charles. And I didn't, just a personal story about this. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I didn't know him particularly well. I was asked to write for his tenure. So I read a bunch of his stuff, and I thought, oh, wow, I thought it was interesting. And this is well before he wrote The Racial Contract. And I really enjoyed and learned a lot from it, and also just liked him humanly. I thought he was a terrific person. And I think my sense about Charles was that he was constantly wrestling with his relationship to this more egalitarian liberal tradition. And that sometimes, he would argue really hard against it. But really what he was doing was, in a very good and important way, trying to argue against himself. That if he was going to embrace this, he wanted to make sure that he had stress tested it as hard as he could. And he would do that by, saying these things that were I think not right about Rawlsian views, but it was his way of trying to come to terms with them, not his way. This is maybe I'm misinterpreting him, but I always thought he was his way of not of dismissing them, but of trying to come to terms with a deeply thoughtful person. But I think there are plenty of people who've written critically about, including you, written critically about what Charles said about Rawls, including Tommy Shelby and
Yes.
Brandon Terry writing about these issues, and I find what they say much more plausible. I guess the way to put it less in terms of the individual characters here, the way I think about racial inequality in the United States, putting racism aside, because it means too many different things. What I think is you have sustained, profound, and multidimensional inequalities. So when I say multidimensional, what I mean is in income, in wealth, in social mobility, in housing ownership, in health, morbidity and mortality. So multidimensional, sustained over a very long period of time, profound. These are not small differences. I mean, income, it's about 1.6x white black. Wealth, it's about 10x white black in a sustained way. And those differences are, to use a Rawlsian phrase, they're present from the start.
Yes.
People are born into them. So whatever you think about those inequalities between and among adults, they have a large impact on the lives of kids who were born into those. And there's an interesting question, which people do argue about rightly. It's a complicated issue to figure out why there are those multidimensional, profound, sustained, present from the start inequalities that bear on life chances. What reproduces that system? But the idea that Rawls didn't know that there were those inequalities, well, that's preposterous. Everybody knows that there are. And the idea that he thought, well, they're okay, that's not a problem. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, I just described multidimensional, profound, sustained, present from the start. I just described inequalities that it's hard to see how they are going to be just. I mean, maybe there's some complicated explanation. It's hard to see how they're going to be just, especially because of their presence from the start, which is going to have a large impact on equality of opportunity. So I've never, maybe it's some, I appreciate your generous remarks about me. Maybe this shows some shallowness on my part, but I've never understood. I mean, literally, I have never understood the idea that the Rawlsian framework about justice is not alive to issues about these, the persistence of racial inequality in the United States. It seems that, of course, it is, but you don't need some special principles of right. Anyway, we're in violent agreement. We're in violent agreement about this, Kiros.
It's amazing. I wish we had connected earlier, because what I did in this article is simply this in analytic terms. What I did is the following. If it is the case, as John Rawls contends, that justice is the virtue of social institutions in the exact sense that thought or truth speaking is to systems of thought. And if it is the case that what we call racism is a violation of these social institutions, that it is unvirtuous. Therefore, by definition, racism is unfair. By definition, you don't have to go beyond that. It is the blatant manifestation of the absence of justice as a virtue, which is the virtue of social institutions. I took this analytic proposition and developed an argument going after Charles Mintz. It doesn't have to be elevated to a third principle of justice. It's simply implied in the first and the second. I hope I'm right.
Well, I hope you're right too, because if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and I don't like to be wrong.
No, do I?
No, that seems that's very well put. I don't think there's any need for any third principles, and it's not because I think the issue is insignificant. No, I don't think it's insignificant. I think it's really incredibly important.
It is by definition there already. Yeah, I was
here already, we are just about at time. I'll just mention that I did a conversation last week in a class at Stanford that's designed to bring people together who disagree on some things. So Glenn Lowry and I had a conversation. And Glenn is an old friend, and I started off, I said, look, we can talk about what we disagree about, but what I want to do is start off by saying what we agree about. And that'll frame the discussion of the disagreements. And I listed, as it turned out, 15 points of agreement, including, I said, there is this issue about multidimensional, profound, sustained racial inequalities that are present from birth, and that's a very large problem. And we can talk about why that gets sustained, and we can hear, but there's something wrong with that, and that I said to Glenn, I think that's one of the things that you and I agree about, and he said he accepted all my 15 points of agreement. So there are three of us.
That's what I love about the way you have been engaging Glenn Lowry. I've been following your friendship with him, and I admire you for at least appreciating the brilliance of this man with all kinds of flaws. You cannot deny Glenn brilliance. He's absolutely.
Yeah.
And you use the Rawlsian principle of appealing to the best part of the self, and then from that you also attend to the differences, because these are differences that cannot be abolished from the nature of the self. This has been one of my best episodes in which you brought me out to practice my craft as a philosopher. I am very grateful to you, and this is going to be a future project between you and I. Every year when you're available, I would like you to come and have a discourse on different issues about our tumultuous time. This has been host Teodros Kiros for the Kiros Report. The Kiros Report is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, and I'm honored to have invited my teacher, my former teacher, Professor Josh Cohen. Thanks for coming to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to see you.